The graveside service ended at 20:15 in the afternoon on a cold October Saturday in Portland, Oregon, and most of the people who had come to say goodbye to my father were already walking back toward the parking lot when I noticed her standing near the far edge of the cemetery, partially behind a large oak tree, watching. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and a composed, careful stillness that people have when they are trying to be present at something, while also being invisible in it. She wore a gray coat and held no umbrella despite the fine mist that had been falling since morning, and she was looking at my father's casket with an expression I had seen before on the faces of people who are grieving someone they do not know how to publicly grieve. I almost did not approach her. The day had already taken everything I had. My father, Walter Brannigan, had died on a Tuesday morning at 72 after a stroke that moved quickly and gave none of us time to prepare, and the week that followed had been the particular kind of exhausting that only death in a family produces, where grief and logistics occupy the same space, and neither one waits for the other to finish. I had been managing arrangements, receiving phone calls, coordinating with my brother Daniel and my mother, who had been divorced from my father for 14 years, but who came anyway because she said Walter had been a decent man and decent men deserved to be sent off properly. I had barely slept. I was not looking for complications, but something made me walk toward her. I am not entirely sure what it was. Perhaps it was the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of a curious bystander, but the stillness of someone who belongs somewhere and is not sure of their right to say so. Perhaps it was something in her face when she looked at the casket. Perhaps it was simply that after a week of people telling me how sorry they were in the rehearsed cadences of condolence, something about her silence was different enough to notice. I walked across the wet grass to the edge of the cemetery where she stood, and when I was close enough that it would have been stranger to turn away than to speak, I said, "Did you know him?" She looked at me with an expression that contained several things at once. There was something that looked like recognition, as though she had known who I was before I crossed the grass toward her. There was something that looked like preparation, the expression of someone who has rehearsed a difficult sentence and is deciding whether now is the time to say it. And there was something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as grief, the plain and unperformable kind. She said, yes. She paused. He was my father. I stood in the October mist at the edge of the cemetery with those 4 words falling through the space between us like stones into still water. And I felt the ground beneath the wet grass shift in a way that had nothing to do with the soil. My name is Nora Brannigan. I am 47 years old. My father was Walter Brannigan, who for 47 years I believed I knew in the complete and ordinary way that daughters know their fathers, which is to say imperfectly but fundamentally, with a confidence that the essential shape of the person is understood, even if the details are sometimes obscure. Walter Brannigan had been a contractor, a man who built things with his hands and took satisfaction in the visible evidence of work completed. He had been married to my mother Ellen for 22 years before the divorce. He had 2 children with my mother, myself, and my brother Daniel, who was 3 years younger than me. He had remarried briefly in his late 50s to a woman named Carol, a marriage that lasted 4 years and ended without acrimony. He had lived in the same house in the Selwood neighborhood of Portland for 30 years. A craftsman bungalow that he maintained with the same meticulous attention he gave to other people's houses. He had been, by any account, a reliable and present father, not demonstrative, not the kind of man who narrated his love or performed it elaborately, but there, present. Accountable, the kind of father who showed up to things. This is what I had known about my father. This is what I believed was the complete picture. The woman standing at the edge of the cemetery with rain misting her dark hair told me her name was Claire Moreau. She told me she was 41 years old. She told me she had grown up in Vancouver, British Columbia, with her mother, a woman named Suzanne Moreau who had met my father in 1981, when they were both working summer jobs near Whistler, and who had discovered she was pregnant 3 months after they parted, and who had raised Claire alone for reasons that Claire said she had spent her entire life trying to understand. I listened to all of this standing in the wet grass while the last of the funeral guests disappeared into the parking lot, and my brother Daniel stood 40 feet away watching me with a careful and uncertain expression. I listened without interrupting because something in me understood, even in those first minutes, that this woman had not come to the funeral of a man she had never met. She had come because she had finally, after 41 years, found something she had been looking for, and she had arrived too late to find it while he was still alive. I said, "Did he know about you?" She said, "That is the question I have been trying to answer my whole life." I drove home from the cemetery in silence. Daniel sat in the passenger's seat and did not speak either, which was its own kind of response, because Daniel was not naturally a quiet person. We sat in the particular silence of two people processing the same information from different angles. And when I pulled into the driveway of the family house where we had gathered all week, the house on Selwood that our father had lived in for 30 years, Daniel finally said, "I thought about Claire's face at the graveside. I thought about the quality of her grief, which was not performed and could not have been performed because grief of that specific texture is not something you manufacture." I said, "Yes, I believe something happened. I do not know yet what the full truth of it is." Daniel was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Dad never said anything, not once." "No," I said, "he didn't." We went inside. My mother was in the kitchen making tea with the purposeful efficiency she adopts when emotion needs somewhere productive to go. I sat at the table and told her what had happened at the cemetery. She listened with the stillness of a woman who has been surprised by life enough times to receive new surprises without visible collapse. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Walter was not a dishonest man. If he knew, he would have told me eventually." She paused. "The question is whether he knew." That question was going to shape the next 8 months of my life. Let me go back further, because to understand what happened in the probate proceedings that followed, you need to understand who my father was and what he had built, and you need to understand what was at stake before the legal situation can make sense. Walter Brannigan had been a contractor for 40 years. He had started his business in his late 20s with a truck, a set of tools, and a willingness to take jobs that other contractors considered too small or too complicated. He had built the business steadily, carefully, the way he built everything, without shortcuts. By the time he retired at 68, Brannigan Construction had 12 employees, a solid reputation across the Portland metro area, and a portfolio of completed projects that included several significant renovations of historic properties in the city. He had sold the business upon retirement and invested the proceeds wisely, which was not something anyone who knew the younger Walter Brannigan would have predicted, because the younger Walter Brannigan had been, by his own account, indifferent to money management. What had changed him on that front was a financial advisor named Thomas Park, who had been working with him since his late 40s and who had spent 15 years quietly and persistently teaching my father the difference between the money you earn and the money you keep. By the time my father died, his estate included the Selwood house, a cabin property on the Oregon coast, an investment portfolio, and a life insurance policy. The total value was something in the range of $2.4 million. Walter Brannigan had a will. He had updated it 3 years before his death. It divided his estate equally between Daniel and me, with a small bequest to a local youth construction trades program that he had supported for years. It was a clean, considered document that reflected the life he had built, and the people he had built it for. What it did not include was any reference to a daughter in Vancouver, British Columbia, who had grown up without him. I called Claire 3 days after the funeral. I had gotten her number from the brief conversation at the graveside, and she had given it to me without hesitation, which I noticed. She answered on the second ring. We talked for an hour. She told me more about her mother Suzanne, who had died of cancer 6 years earlier. She told me that Suzanne had been, by Claire's description, a private and self-sufficient woman who had spoken of Walter Brannigan rarely, and always with a carefully neutral tone that told Claire nothing useful about what had actually happened between them. She told me that Suzanne had refused to seek any financial support from Walter throughout Claire, had refused to contact him or allow Claire to contact him, and had taken those reasons with her when she died. After Suzanne died, Claire had begun looking. She had access to her mother's papers, which she had spent 2 years going through carefully, and in those papers she had found enough to begin understanding the shape of what had happened in the summer of 1981. She had found letters. Not from my father. From her mother to a friend, written in the fall of 1981, that described a relationship with a man named Walter from Portland, who was warm and funny and who she thought she might love, and who she had decided, after learning she was pregnant, she would not contact, because she had too much pride to be the kind of problem that landed on a man's doorstep, and she would rather raise her child alone than spend her life wondering whether she was wanted or merely tolerated. That was Suzanne Moreau. A woman I never met who made a decision out of pride and love, and something that may have been fear and whose decision shaped everything that came after. Claire had found my father's name in those letters, and had found him through public records, and had spent a year deciding whether to contact him. She had called the Selwood house twice and hung up both times. She had written a letter that she never sent. She had driven to Portland once and sat in her car on the street outside the house for 45 minutes before driving back to the highway and going home. She had been working up to something for years, and then the something she had been working up to was taken away from her by a Tuesday morning stroke that did not ask whether she was ready. I listened to all of this and I felt, alongside the grief for my father and the shock of this revelation, something else, something that took me a while to identify correctly. It was sorrow for Claire. Not pity, which is a diminished and slightly condescending thing, but actual sorrow. The specific sorrow of understanding that a person had spent 41 years on the outside of something that had been inside my life all along, and that the door had closed before she could reach it. Then the legal situation arrived and complicated everything. The letter came to Daniel and me through a probate attorney 6 weeks after the funeral. The attorney's name was Gregory Holt, and he represented Claire in a formal petition to the estate of Walter Brannigan. The petition stated that Claire Moreau was the biological daughter of Walter Brannigan, and as such held a legal claim to a share of his estate under Oregon intestate succession principles. The petition requested a DNA verification of the biological relationship, and pending that verification, a stay on the distribution of estate assets. Daniel called me the same afternoon the letter arrived. His voice had the tight, controlled quality it gets when he is angry, but has decided to be strategic about the anger. He said, "She is filing a claim." I said, "I know. I received the same letter," he said. "We built nothing with her. Dad built nothing with her. She appears at a funeral and then files a claim on an estate she has no connection to." I said, "Daniel." He said, "What?" I said, "Her father died without ever knowing she existed, or without ever acknowledging that she existed. Either way, she lost something that cannot be returned. I think we need to hold both things at the same time before we decide what to do." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you saying we should just give her a portion of the estate?" I said, "I am saying I do not know yet what the right thing is, and I do not want to decide before I understand the full truth." The full truth required investigation. Our estate attorney, a woman named Laura Cho, who had handled our family's legal matters for a decade, advised us that the petition had procedural merit because Oregon law does recognize posthumous paternity claims, and that the appropriate first step was to respond to the petition with a request for the DNA verification that the petition itself had proposed. She said that if the DNA confirmed the biological relationship, the legal question of Claire's inheritance rights would depend on whether she could establish that our father had known about her existence. Because in Oregon a parent's knowing failure to acknowledge a child can affect the analysis of intestate claims even when there is a valid will. That phrase stopped me, knowing failure to acknowledge. I asked Laura what that meant practically. She said it meant we needed to understand, as best as the evidence would allow, whether Walter Brannigan had known about Claire Moreau. If he had not known, the legal and moral calculus was different than if he had known and had chosen silence. I spent the next month doing something I had not expected to do in the months following my father's death, which was trying to understand my father's past as something other than my father's past. When you are a child and then an adult and then the child of a dead man, you experience your parent's history as a backdrop, as context, as the scenery through which your own story moves. You know the broad outlines. You have the stories they chose to tell. You do not typically investigate the chapters they chose not to open. I was investigating now. I called Thomas Park, my father's financial advisor, who had known him since my father's late 40s. Thomas was 70 now, retired, and willing to talk with the careful honesty of someone who has decided that the truth serves people better than comfortable omission. He told me that my father had mentioned, once in passing, a summer he spent near Whistler when he was young, a summer that he described as one of those times in a person's life when you are entirely free in a way you only understand later. He told me my father had mentioned a woman from that summer. He did not remember her name. He said my father had said something about her once in the context of a larger conversation about choices and roads not taken, and the things you carry that you cannot put down. He said my father had seemed to carry something from that summer that was not entirely resolved. He said he had not thought much of it at the time because most men his age carried something unresolved from their 20s, and it was not his job to excavate it. I asked him whether my father had ever mentioned a child. Thomas Park was quiet for a long moment. He said, not in so many words. He said my father had said once, after his second marriage ended, that he sometimes wondered whether there was someone in the world he should have done better by but did not know how to find. He said he had taken that as the general regret of a man reviewing his life, and not as anything specific, he said. Looking back, he was not certain that interpretation was correct. I drove to Vancouver. I did not tell Daniel I was going. I called Claire and told her I was coming, and she said she would meet me and we could look at her mother's papers together if I was willing. I was willing. Claire lived in a tidy apartment in East Vancouver, with high ceilings and bookshelves that covered an entire wall, and a small kitchen table, where she had already laid out a series of folders when I arrived. She made coffee without asking whether I wanted it, which I took as the gesture of a woman who had been living with a particular kind of loneliness long enough to be practiced at the kind of small hospitality that does not require confirmation. We sat across from each other at the table. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. There was something in the arrangement of her face that I was not prepared for. A particular angle of the jaw, a particular quality of the eyes that I had seen in photographs of my father as a young man, and that I was seeing again now in the face of a woman I had just met. We looked at everything Suzanne had left. The letters to her friend, written in the fall of 1981, which described Walter from Portland with the careful warmth of a woman who has decided not to hope for something, but cannot quite prevent herself from wanting it. A photograph, small and faded, of a man and a woman standing outside what appeared to be a restaurant or lodge, squinting into summerlight. The man in the photograph was young, perhaps 29 or 30, with dark hair and a broad build, and a smile that I recognized as completely and specifically my father's behind him. Visible at the edge of the frame was a mountain. Suzanne had written on the back of the photograph in pencil, Whistler, August 1981. Walter and me. I held that photograph for a long time. It was the most direct evidence I had that this was real, that the conversation at the graveside had been the beginning of something true, and not a mistake or an intrusion or a misunderstanding. My father at 29 standing outside a lodge in Whistler with a woman he would leave and apparently never contact again, not knowing or perhaps knowing that something was beginning in that summer that would outlast his knowledge of it. There was also this, in the folder, a single envelope, unsealed, that Suzanne had kept in a box of personal papers that Claire had found after her mother's death. The envelope contained 2 items. The first was a photograph of Claire as an infant, perhaps 2 months old, with a date written on the back in Suzanne's handwriting, December 1982. The second was a single sheet of paper on which Suzanne had written, in a hand that was different from the careful script of her letters, something that read more like thinking on paper, like a person working through a decision while writing rather than reporting a decision already made. It said, I have thought about whether to tell him. I think about it most days. But if I tell him and he does not come, it will be worse than if I never told him. And if I tell him and he does come, I do not know whether he comes for me or because he feels he must. Either way, I am not certain it is better. Claire will be mine and she will be enough, and I will not ask for something that may not be there to give. Suzanne Moreau had decided not to tell him. That was not the same as saying he had known. That was not the same as saying he had failed to acknowledge a child he was aware of. That was a woman making a choice, a painful and private and not entirely selfless choice. But her choice, made in the fall of 1982 in Vancouver with a 2-month-old infant and a pride and a grief that I could read in those unsteady lines of handwriting across 4 decades of distance. I put the paper down carefully. I looked at Claire. She said, I did not know about this until I went through her things after she died. She kept this for 30 years without telling me she had made the decision not to tell him. I said, Did she ever try? After you were born, at any point? Claire said. Not that I can find evidence of. She said she believed her mother had made the decision in the fall of 1982 and had lived inside it without looking back, because looking back was not something Suzanne Moreau did. I said, If he did not know, then everything is different. Claire looked at me with an expression that was carefully calibrated, not hopeful, not calculating. Just honest, she said. I am not filing this claim because I want money that belongs to you and Daniel. I want you to know that. I am filing it because I want the legal record to reflect that I existed in relation to him. That I was his daughter whether he knew it or not. That my life has a father in it, even if that father is only in the past tense now. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, what if there were another way to achieve that? The DNA test was arranged through the probate proceedings and took 3 weeks to process. The results came back on a Thursday morning and confirmed what the photograph from Whistler and the angle of Claire's jaw had already told me. Walter Brannigan was Claire Moreau's biological father. The certainty was complete. She was his daughter. She had always been his daughter. He had simply never known it. The legal proceedings that followed were handled, on our side by Laura Cho and, on Claire's side, by Gregory Holt. Daniel had hired a separate attorney to represent his specific interests, a decision I understood even if I did not entirely share his position on how to proceed. Daniel's view was that the will was valid, that Claire had not been part of our father's known life, and that the estate should be distributed as our father had instructed. He was not cruel about it. He was practical. He said, Nora, Dad wrote a will. He knew what he had and he knew who he wanted to have it. We should respect that. I understood his argument. I did not think it was complete. My counter-argument was this. Our father's will had been written by a man who did not know he had a third child. If he had known, if someone had told Walter Brannigan on a Tuesday morning before his stroke that there was a woman in Vancouver, 41 years old, who was his daughter, I had no doubt whatsoever about what he would have done. I had lived with Walter Brannigan for the first 21 years of my life. I knew how he operated. He showed up. He was accountable. He built things that lasted. A man who showed up for everything he knew about would not have ignored something as fundamental as a child. If he had known there was one, the will was not a statement of his values. It was a document written from incomplete information. The court hearing was scheduled for early spring. The courtroom was in the Multnomah County Courthouse, a room with tall windows and the particular quality of institutional quiet that settles in legal spaces where difficult human situations are regularly resolved. I sat beside Laura at the plaintiff's table. Though I was not the plaintiff, I had filed a formal statement with the court separate from Daniel's response, a statement that said I did not oppose the establishment of Claire's biological relationship to my father through the DNA evidence, and that I wished to address the court regarding the disposition of the estate. Judge Sandra Wu presided. She was perhaps 60 with silver, streaked hair and the focused patience of a judge who has learned that probate matters involving family relationships require a different kind of attention than straightforward asset disputes. Gregory Holt presented Claire's case first. He walked the court through the DNA evidence, the history documented in Suzanne's papers, and the Oregon legal framework for posthumous paternity claims. He was measured and clear and presented the case as what it was, which was the documentation of a biological relationship that had existed for 41 years without formal acknowledgement, through no fault of the child. Daniel's attorney, a man named Curtis Webb, responded by arguing that the will was a valid legal instrument reflecting Walter Brannigan's actual intentions at the time of its execution, that no evidence had been presented that Walter had known about Claire, and that the absence of knowledge meant the will accurately reflected his wishes as he understood them. Then Laura stood and addressed the court on my behalf. She said that I had chosen to provide the court with evidence that I believed was directly relevant to the question of what Walter Brannigan would have wanted, had he known the complete picture. She said that in the weeks following the funeral, I had conducted an investigation into my father's history that had produced several items of significance. She presented the statement from Thomas Park, the financial advisor, including his recollection of my father's comment about wondering whether there was someone in the world he should have done better by but did not know how to find. She presented a statement from my father's oldest friend, a man named Gerald McCabe who had known Walter Brannigan since they were both in their 20s and who had retired to Bend, Oregon, and who had told me in a conversation that I had recorded with his knowledge and consent that my father had mentioned the Whistler summer more than once over the decades. Always with the quality of unfinished business. Always with the particular gravity of a man who suspects he left something important unresolved, but cannot find the door back to it. She then presented something I had not planned to present until I found it, which was found in the Selwood house during the week that Daniel and I were going through our father's belongings after the funeral. It was in the top drawer of the desk in his home office, beneath a folder of utility records. It was a single index card, handwritten in my father's blocky contractor's handwriting, with 2 pieces of information on it. The first was a name, Suzanne Moreau. The second was a Vancouver telephone number with a date written beside it, 2019. My father had looked her up 3 years before his death. He had found a name and a number and had written them on an index card and put it in the drawer beneath his utility records. I did not know what to make of that index card when I found it. I still do not know entirely what to make of it. It could mean that he had been carrying the question for years and had finally in 2019 reached the point of trying to find the answer. It could mean he had called that number. It could mean he had found that Suzanne had died 6 years earlier and had not known what to do with that information, and had put the card in the drawer and had carried it forward as another unresolved thing. I could not ask him. He was not there to ask. What I knew was that the card existed, that my father had written Suzanne Moreau's name and a Vancouver number on an index card in 2019, and kept it. That this was not the act of a man who was unaware of the question. It was the act of a man who was circling something he had not yet found the courage or the clarity to approach directly. Laura placed the index card before Judge Wu. The card had been photographed and authenticated as part of the evidence submission. The courtroom was very quiet while the judge examined it. Laura said, "Your Honor, the evidence before the court presents a picture of a man who had, by 2019 at the latest, some awareness that there was a question in his past that had not been resolved, and who had taken a first step toward finding an answer without completing that step before his death." She said, "My client Nora Brannigan's position is not that the will should be overturned. It is that the will should be understood as the document of a man who was operating with incomplete information, and that the court has the equitable authority to consider what distribution would most closely reflect what Walter Brannigan would have chosen had he known all the facts." Curtis Webb objected. He said there was no direct evidence that Walter had known about Claire specifically, only that he had the name of a woman from his past, and that inferring from that card what Walter would have wanted was speculation. Laura said, respectfully, "All will interpretation involves some inference about what the testator would have wanted in circumstances they did not anticipate. That is the nature of equitable probate proceedings." Judge Wu looked at the index card for a long moment. She looked at the statement from Thomas Park. She looked at the statement from Gerald McCabe. Then she looked at the DNA results. Then she looked across the courtroom. First at Daniel, then at Claire, then at me. She said, "I have been a probate judge for 16 years. She said she had seen every variety of family complexity that death produces. She said the case before her was unusual not because of its legal complexity, which was moderate, but because of the quality of evidence regarding the intentions and awareness of the deceased. She said, the DNA evidence establishes without question that Claire Moreau is the biological daughter of Walter Brannigan. That is not in dispute. The question before this court is whether Walter Brannigan's will, executed without knowledge of Claire Moreau's existence as his daughter, should govern the entire distribution of his estate, or whether this court should exercise equitable authority to recognize a relationship the will could not have anticipated." She said she was prepared to rule. She said that the index card constituted meaningful evidence that by 2019, Walter Brannigan had at minimum some awareness of an unresolved question related to Suzanne Moreau, and that this awareness, combined with the testimony of Thomas Park and Gerald McCabe, supported an inference that Walter Brannigan carried some consciousness of the possibility that he had a child he did not know about. She said she could not conclude that he had known specifically about Claire, but she could conclude that the possibility had not been entirely absent from his mind in his final years. She said, "Under Oregon Equitable Probate Authority, I am ordering a modification to the estate distribution." She said the existing estate would be distributed as follows. The Selwood house and its contents would go to Daniel and Nora, as specified in the will, because that house was the product of 30 years of Walter Brannigan's presence in the lives of those specific children, and it was appropriate for it to remain with them. The Coast cabin, however, would go to Claire Moreau, as a recognition of her biological standing, and as the court's acknowledgement that Walter Brannigan had a third child whose existence deserved formal recognition in the disposition of what he had built. The investment portfolio and life insurance would be divided equally among all 3 children. She brought the gavel down once. Daniel sat very still for a long moment. Then he looked at me. His expression was complex, not angry exactly. More the expression of someone who has been expecting a particular outcome and has received a different one and is in the process of adjusting. I looked at Claire. She was looking at the judge's desk. Her composure was holding, but only just. I could see the quality of her controlled breathing, the slight tension around her jaw that was keeping everything together. After the hearing, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Daniel walked up to me and stood beside me without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "The cabin," I said. "Yes," he said. "Dad loved that cabin," I said. "I know." He said, "You think you would have wanted this." I thought about the index card in the desk drawer. I thought about a man writing a name on a piece of paper in 2019 and keeping it. I thought about what Gerald McCabe had said about my father's quality of unfinished business around that summer. I said, "I think he would have wanted to have done right by her. I think he ran out of time to figure out how. And I think this is what doing right looks like from here." Daniel was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I hope she'll take care of the place." He turned and walked toward the elevator. That was Daniel's version of acceptance, which was characteristically indirect and characteristically sufficient. I walked back into the lobby where Claire was standing with Gregory Holt. When she saw me coming, she said something to Gregory quietly, and he moved a few steps away to give us space. I walked up to her and we stood across from each other the way we had stood at the graveside in October. In the mist with the ground shifting beneath us. She said, "Nora?" I said. "Yes." She said, "I want you to know that I did not come to that funeral to take anything from you." I said, "I know." She said, "I came because he was my father and I had run out of time and I needed to say goodbye even though I had never said hello." I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I want to tell you some things about him, if you want to know." She looked at me with an expression I will not forget for as long as I live. It was not relief, exactly. It was something more like the expression of a person who has been standing outside a door for a very long time and has just been invited in. She said, "I would like that very much." We had coffee in a diner near the courthouse. We sat for 2 hours. I told her about the Selwood house and the Craftsman bungalow and how our father maintained it with the same meticulous attention he gave to other people. Houses. I told her about his Sunday morning habit of driving to a specific bakery in southeast Portland for a specific pastry that he had been buying from the same place for 20 years. I told her about the youth construction trades program he had supported for the last decade of his life, how he had started going to the students' graduation ceremonies, and how he had told me once that watching a young person understand, for the first time, that they could build something with their hands, was one of the most satisfying things he had witnessed. I told her about his sense of humor, which was dry and timing, dependent, and which had taken me until my teens to fully appreciate. I told her about the way he looked at the ocean from the deck of the coast cabin, which was the way people look at things they love without agenda, without purpose. Just the plain sustaining fact of the thing being there. Claire listened to everything. She asked questions that were specific and careful, the questions of someone who is trying to assemble something from pieces they have not had before. She asked what his laugh sounded like. She asked whether he had been patient. She asked whether he had ever talked about regrets. I told her what I knew. I told her the truth as completely as I could give it. I said he had been patient in the way of people who learned patience from building things that required it, slowly and by practice, rather than by nature. I said he had talked about regrets occasionally, in the way men of his generation sometimes allow themselves to talk about such things. Obliquely, in the context of other conversations, with the careful indirection that is the only vocabulary some people have for the things that matter most to them. I said he had seemed, in the last years of his life, to be a man who was at peace with most of what he had done and quietly unresolved about something he could not quite name. I did not tell her about the index card in detail. Laura had presented it in court. Claire knew it existed. I did not need to revisit it to make the point it made. Instead, I said, "I think he was looking. I think he was moving toward something in the last years and he did not get there in time. And I am sorry for that. For both of you, she said. I used to be angry at him. When I was younger, I thought he had chosen not to know me, which felt like a decision made against me specifically. It took me a long time to understand that absence and abandonment are not always the same thing, that sometimes people are absent because the information that would have brought them present was withheld, and that the withholding, however well-intentioned, has its own consequences. I said, Your mother loved you, what she decided. She decided from love, she said. I know that. I have always known that. It does not change what it cost, but I have made peace with it, mostly. She paused. I came to Portland because I needed to make peace with him too. Whatever that looked like, whatever was still possible at this late hour. I said, Is this enough? What happened today? Is it enough for that? She thought about it for a long moment. Then she said, It is more than I expected, and it is a beginning. In the months that followed, Claire came to Portland twice. I took her to the Selwood house, which had not yet been sold, and walked her through it. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She stood in the doorway of the workshop in the backyard where our father had kept his tools, organized on pegboards with the outlines drawn in marker so each one had a precise place to return to, and she looked at it with an expression I recognized from the cemetery. That composed and careful grief of someone in the presence of something they belong to, and are not sure of their right to say so. I said, You belong here too. You can take your time with it. She picked up a small hand plane from the workbench, turned it over in her hands and set it down carefully. She said, He kept everything in order, I said. He did. That was him entirely. We went to the coast cabin in April, all three of us. Daniel came, which had not been certain until the week before. He arrived at the cabin before us and had already made coffee and was standing on the deck looking at the ocean when Claire and I pulled up. He turned around when he heard the car, and he looked at Claire with the complex and slightly awkward expression of someone who is trying to recalibrate a relationship he had not expected to be having, who has decided to try anyway because the alternative is worse, he said. Claire, she said, Daniel. He said, This is a good place. Dad spent a lot of time here, she said. I can see why. They stood side by side on the deck for a while looking at the Pacific. I stood a few steps behind them and let the moment be what it was, which was imperfect and genuine and sufficient. There is no clean lesson at the end of a story like this. Or rather, there are several, and they do not resolve into a single clear directive the way simpler stories do. What I know from this experience is that families are built from information, and that when the information is incomplete, the family that gets built is real but partial. A structure erected on a foundation that has a section missing, and that the missing section is still there even when no one can see it, exerting pressure in ways that only become visible when something finally gives. I know that the choices people make when they are young and afraid and alone have consequences that travel forward through time in ways they cannot anticipate. And that land, decades later, in courtrooms and gravesides and kitchen tables and the decks of coast cabins, where strangers who share blood stand looking at the same ocean, and trying to figure out what they owe each other, and what they are allowed to feel. I know that a man can carry something unresolved in a desk drawer, and on an index card and in the quality of his voice when he talks about roads not taken, and that this carrying is itself a form of acknowledgement, insufficient and private, but not nothing. I know that two women who might have been adversaries in a legal proceeding can choose differently, and that the choosing differently is harder and slower, and less satisfying in the immediate term than the adversarial version. But that it produces something the adversarial version cannot, which is the possibility of a real relationship built on the truth of what actually happened rather than on the positions people take when they are protecting themselves from that truth. Claire has the coast cabin now. She has been there 3 times since the estate was settled. She sent me a photograph from the deck last month, taken in the early morning when the light was flat and gray and the ocean was very still. She said in the message accompanying the photograph that she had been sitting on the deck with coffee, and that she had thought about our father standing in that same place looking at that same view, and that she was trying to understand what he had seen when he looked at it, what it gave him that kept bringing him back. I wrote back and told her that I thought what it gave him was the same thing it was giving her now, which was a place where everything was very large and very quiet and where a person could sit with what they were carrying and let it be as big as it actually was without apologizing for the size of it. She wrote back and said, Yes. That is exactly it. My father died not knowing he had 3 children. That is the unresolved thing at the center of this story. The fact that cannot be made right by any legal proceeding, or any coffee conversation, or any morning on a cabin deck. He lived 72 years building things, and showing up and being accountable to the people he knew he was accountable to. And in the dark corner of his past there was a daughter he did not know about who grew up without him, and who stood in the October mist at the edge of a Portland cemetery, and called him Dad in the only moment that was left to her. Too late for him to hear it and too late for her to know whether he would have been glad. He would have been glad, I am certain of that. I carry that certainty the way I carry the other things I know about him. The early morning pastry runs and the workshop with the marked pegboards and the way he looked at the ocean. It is part of the complete picture now. The complete picture is harder to hold than the partial one was, but it is the true one, and truth, even when it arrives too late and costs more than you planned, is worth holding accurately. Claire is my sister. Daniel is still my brother. The family is larger than it was and differently shaped, and it holds things that are still being understood. That is the state of it. That is, I think, enough.